just back to the solver side, the performance is quite a bit behind. You can use time sampling to basically reduce the size of the problem. That works well in terms of making the problems more tractable, but you do start to get some of the issues around for example, the variability of wind gets smoothed quite a lot. Same thing on PD if you time sample too much. So yeah, the performance I think of highs isn't quite up to the commercial solver yet. But we're hopeful. It seems that there's a lot of investment and development that's happening in that space. Some of the commercial solvers, like the C-opt solver, for example, they provide a 6 month, or if you're from an academic institution, I think they give you a 1 year demo of the solver. And if you're from a commercial institute, it's 6 months. So that's a very good way to get the kind of foot in the door and understand the performance difference between the commercial solvers and the open source solvers. Should we maybe let's just take a 5 minute break? Are there any other questions? I'd happy to take in, and then we can just take a quick break. Nothing else. Has everyone gone to sleep?
We're still here.
Okay. So we'll take a 5 minute break, and then we'll kind of dive into a bit more of the detail around the actual pypsa RSA model, and then the scripts that we use to assemble the weather data and convert that into power generation profiles. So I think we'll be back at, let's call it 5 to 12. Okay, I think in the interest of time, we can get started again. So that was a very brief introduction and a simple demo network. And now we'll get into a bit more of the substantive info around the actual pypsa RSA model that we've been working on. So the first thing is, in order to get access to the model, what you want to do is to go to our GitHub repository. So if you follow that link, then you can essentially come here to, you'll see there's something called pypsa RSA. And what you want to do is essentially clone this repository to your GitHub. So that's quite easy to do. If you, for example, we can follow this link, and you can come here and you can copy that URL. And if you go to GitHub desktop that you've installed, you can go clone repository and you can paste that URL in there and click clone. What that's going to do is that's going to fetch all the required files that are currently sitting in that repository, and it's going to put them in a folder over here. So what you'll see is now essentially a sort of direct duplication of all these folders that you're going to find on the web. At the moment, there is some data that you need to run the model, which is too big to upload to GitHub. So we will be, I think by the time for our next workshop on Friday, we will provide a Dropbox download link where you can get any outstanding data that you need to be able to run the model. Okay, so you've now cloned this repository. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you can click open in Visual Studio Code. And what that will do is that's going to open that repository where you're at, and you'll now see all the files. So what you need to do to essentially install all the libraries to be able to use this model, you'll see there's a folder here called for environments, and that has a list of all the packages that you need to run the model. At the moment, we've just duplicated the pypsa Earth repository in terms of the packages that be required, but it should work. You can let us know if there's any challenges. So in order to install from this file, what you'll see here is you want to use this command. So this just tells Conda to use the file environment.yaml, and you can use that to install. I can't remember if it's sensitive to if it's YAML or YML. So just maybe double check that. But you have to run that command from in this folder. So at the moment, we're in the main repository, and so now I've changed my directory, and you can see there's the environment.yaml file. And if I ran that command now, it'll work. So now you have environments called pypsa Earth updated. Well, sorry, it's going to say that's the repository I'm using. You're going to have an environment called pypsa RSA, and you're going to want to change through. So can't remember if I've installed on this machine or not. Yeah, I have. So you can change your environment to pypsa RSA. So now you've downloaded the files, and you've hopefully managed to get the install of your environment done. So just a quick snapshot of what the pypsa RSA model is. So as I say, it's predominantly we use it as a capacity expansion model, and it can look at both a sort of a single node model or a spatially resolved model that has multiple nodes. Obviously, just bearing in mind the computational complexity that's involved. So you can't do perfect four-side expansion, for example, on a large number of years with multiple spatial nodes. So what essentially we do is we focus on, if you wanted to do a high resolution model, say with 34 nodes, you would typically do that for a single year at some point in the future to understand some more of those spatial aspects. But we find the 10 supply node model at the level of the ESCOM supply areas works quite well in terms of a balance between capturing some of the spatial diversity in the capacity expansion model, but not making it too computation intensive that the model isn't tractable anymore. By default, we have been running full chronology in our model. So we solve 8,760 hours in every year, but we don't solve every year into the future. So for our RP work, what we did was we solved in single year steps up to 2030. And then as the level of uncertainty of the future gets higher and higher, what we did was spread out the resolution more and more. So we then went in 5-year steps from 2030 to 2050, for example. In terms of the time series aggregation, basically what we have built in is the ULIC, it's a library called TSAM, the time series aggregation model. And what that provides is some mechanisms for if you want to reduce the size of your models. And it follows basically, I think it's basically an agglomerative clustering. So what happens is if you tell the model that instead of every hour in the year, you want every third hour, one easy way would be to just work out averages. But what the TSAM models, the segmentation function allows you to do is work out based on your load and different generator parameters where your highest gradients are likely to be. And what it does is it puts more hours in those high gradient regions. And when the gradients are a bit lower, then it averages those snapshots together. So it's kind of, you can think of it as a smart averaging. There is additional functionality within the TSAM module if you want to dig into it a bit more and use that for your studies. For example, you can do representative weeks, and there's a lot of functionality that's more similar to Plexus in that respect in terms of how you would do clustering. So what does the model actually look like? Well, really all it is a series of Python scripts that get run in a structured way in order to basically take a range of input data, to pre-process that input data, generate a network, solve the network, and then post-process the results. So essentially there's a set of core scripts that are used to do this. And what you'll see is under the folder scripts, what we have is a script called, the first one that really runs is something called build topology. And what that does is it takes all the GIS data that we have on existing and planned ESCOM lines, and there may be some manual lines that we want to add into that. And we can use that to generate basically a representation of the inter-regional transfer capacities. The next step that happens is then, so we've got the lines between different regions. What we do is we build the base pypsa object. And what that will do is it will say, okay, here are all the different buses for the regions. And then essentially these are the lines that connect those buses. So at the moment, then there's still no generators or anything. You just have this kind of topology network that's been built. And then the next script is where a lot of the heavy lifting happens, and that's called add electricity. So add electricity is all about assembling all the information that you have about different generators, whether they're existing generators, extendable generators. In some cases, you might have build limits, so in terms of what you can install each year. And we also put the load data. And all of that then gets assembled into this network. So now we have a network that has buses, lines, generation and storage and loads. And then essentially we see if there's any pre-processing that needs to happen. So there might be some additional global constraints that need to be applied. For example, CO2 constraints. And a lot of that then happens in the script called prepare and solve network. So what that does is it's going to add in any final constraints. It's going to do some checks to make sure that there aren't any infeasibilities in terms of how some of the generators are specified. And then there's also any custom constraints that get written that get added to that model. And all those custom constraints are included under the custom constraints Python file. Finally, that will then, in that same script, it's going to assemble the model. It's going to run that model through whichever solver that you've applied, and it's going to generate a .lp file, which is kind of the native format that the solver is expecting. It's going to solve that and then essentially return your solved network object. From there, then you can use some scripts to post-process that data from that model file where it got saved. So at the moment, we're just busy cleaning up some of the post-processing scripts because it's just been our internal code. So the post-processing scripts aren't currently available on GitHub, but they will be published soon. In terms of then how you would actually set up and run different scenarios, we've really got a layer of scenario management that we've then built on top of this. And this is predominantly an Excel-based input with different assumptions. And you can essentially define a whole range of different sub-scenarios that then get all assembled into one specific overall scenario. So wherever you see kind of a green block, that is an Excel input file, and we'll go through that in a lot more detail next week of kind of how you can use those to define a scenario and run a scenario. What we're going to focus on just after I've done an overview of the model is this block here, and really how we can take a lot of GIS data, and that's including weather data, the different regions that we want to model, and how that goes through a wind and solar PV plant model, using different libraries that are available, and then ultimately that generates the netcdf file that can be read in and used in the workflow. What we found is in the original pypsa, for example, the pypsa Earth repositories, this is part of the full SnakeMake workflow. But we found that it's better to have this as kind of a separate unit where it's some simple to use different Jupyter notebooks. And ultimately what we're going to provide on our Dropbox. So some of this, you need a lot of data, for example, from WASA and from NREL if you wanted to run those. But we'll provide a pre-processed netcdf file as well. So if you basically ERA 5 and Sarah are the two most user-friendly sources to work with, but we'll provide a network file that, or sorry, a netcdf file that you can use that covers all of these data regions. And if you need us to add a region or something and rerun it, then that is possible as well. Unfortunately, I don't think we can provide the raw data that we've downloaded from these sites that you'd probably have to get, you'd have to directly download it yourself. We essentially spent a fair amount of time downloading data over the Christmas period where the servers for these were quiet. So we used that gap to get all the data ourselves. In terms of different spatial resolutions that are possible in the model, so there's currently a shape file. Basically, you can provide the model any arbitrary shape file. that you can then use for the analysis. So we have kind of our standard single node model where there isn't any basic representation of the transmission network. Then we've got the 10 node model, which we are starting to use for some capacity expansion studies. And then there's the high resolution model. So this was the 27 nodes was the original ESCOM 27 supply areas, which have kind of, I think, become 34 nodes now. So generally anything at this level of detail, probably even the 34 nodes, you're only going to be able to really run at a single year view. But it is useful to understand a bit more detail about how generation might be optimally located within a region rather than the more broad view. But we think this 10 node model is kind of a very good starting point to understand some of the impacts of different grid expansion trajectories. And you can start to test things, for example, like, does it make sense to build more renewables in Mpumalanga, or does it make sense to increase the levels of curtailment? What should the wind PV mix be when you've got constraints in different parts of the network? What is it? How much curtailment should we be looking at? Those kind of things. What happens if you strengthen the network faster than planned? How much extra capacity does that unlock, etc. So those are all kind of things that you could test in the 10 node model or the 34 node model. In terms of then just what some of those networks would look like. So this is kind of your connection, your inter-transfer regions for the 10 node model. And you can see the kind of level of complexity and detail that increases as you increase the spatial resolution. So this is just a connection of all these different shapefile regions for the 34 node model. What we've done, so in terms of GIS data, we'll speak about it a little bit later as well, but essentially we've tried to update the information that we have from the TDP. So what we've done is, unfortunately, the latest TDP information isn't available in GIS format, but ESCOM has provided GIS data for existing lines, I think, back to 2018. So we've taken that data and then we've geo-referenced and digitized any new lines that are planned over time. So different 765 and 400 kV lines. And that data is now available as part of the data set. It's not currently in the repo because it's a bit too big, I think, to upload. So that'll be available in our Dropbox at the end of next week. In terms of how the line loading potential is calculated between different regions, I think we're a bit short on time. So I think we'll park this until next week. We can go through a bit more detail how we estimate the transfer capacities between different regions. Ultimately, we're kind of relying on, excuse the background noise, we're relying on Sinclair curves and looking at different surge impedance loading calculations, and we've got a way to then estimate how much energy could be moved at maximum between areas. But this is a very technical area, and Ronald has been very kind to kind of point us in the right direction, but there's a lot of kind of information that goes into this and where lines are compensated, etc. So use with caution, and we hope that we can definitely update and refine these numbers and methodology as we move on. So getting to the kind of wind and PV modeling, essentially at a kind of very broad level, what these series of scripts do is they take hourly satellite weather data available from different sources. That hourly weather data then goes through a power plant model where it gets converted into an hourly generation data profile. So that's basically what we can we can use to estimate what the renewable energy generation would be from plants located in different regions. Then what we look at is different geographical regions, and you can then get an aggregate profile of what the plants might be generating for that region. So ultimately, for example, for the 10-node model, what we would do is we have different exclusion zones, which I'll show you, and then we try to work out, well, if we were to fill up a certain amount of this area with these kind of generators in this area, this is the kind of production profile that we could expect. So one of the things that we've done to try just sanity check and calibrate is we've taken the exact fleet generation output data from the Eskom data portal for the solar PV and wind fleets. So obviously we don't have any plant specific data, but we have the aggregate of what the fleet's doing. And what we've done is rebuild that fleet. So we took all the locations. So we did a lot of sleuthing around like AC/DC ratios along all the PV plants. So for example, most project developers will quote their plants on a megawatt peak because it's a higher number and it looks better. And then the actual kind of bid amount is on the AC side, so we could use that to kind of back calculate an AC/DC ratio, and then also look at if it's a single axis tracking plant or if it was fixed tilt, for example. On wind, we mainly were looking at hub height, so we tried to find as much info as we could for each site, so in terms of what the hub height that was used for the technology. And what we did is we rebuilt these fleets, and then we compared them and ran them to the actual Eskom data portal over the same period of time. So using the same year's weather data, went through our model and outputs, and then we looked at how well the agreement is, and we can see that. I mean, we were really surprised how well the wind profile is represented. And I'll show you a few other snapshots in the year that this isn't a cherry-picked example, that in general, you can follow the trends of generation quite closely. Obviously, this excludes the fact that some of those plants might be curtailing at some point. We might not know about that. And you might have some plants that we overestimating and some that we're underestimating, and the average aggregate profile looks pretty good. But the biggest thing is to just make sure that you're capturing, for example, these main trends of like where you have different weather systems moving through. And that seems to be very well represented in the model. So some of the data that you will need to download to be able to use the model. So now we're talking specifically around the solar and wind generation portions. The first is GIS data from the DFFE, and you just have to register on their website. And then there's so here's a link in order to download this data. And these are the shape files that we're using in the model. So we've got power corridors, and we've got the red zones. So that's one set of data. Then we also have the protected and conservation areas. And finally, also the renewable energy EIA application database. So these are the different types of GIS data that we use to restrict which are the areas that we want to model and get a profile for. But again, you can change all of these, and if you wanted to model every location within a region, you can do that as well quite easily. The Eskom GIS data that I mentioned for the transmission network that you're going to want to download. So as I said, you can get the I think just this might be the wrong link. I think this is the link to the latest or to the 2018 GIS data, and then this is to the latest GCCA info. But as I said, we kind of had to manually digitize these images, and we are kind of hoping that ESCOM can help us by giving us the actual data, because that'll be a lot more accurate than us kind of tracing lines, and it gets a bit difficult to see exactly where everything's going. In terms of the available weather data that we used, so as I said, there's different sources that are available for satellite data. Probably the most broadly used is ERA5. So that's a reanalysis weather data set. I'm a bit of a Luddite when it comes to these, but basically, in my understanding, what it is it's a it's not a forecast model, it's a backwards looking model. And essentially that weather model is tweaked all the time to kind of to calibrate it against certain parameters that are measured. So it's kind of a model that's tweaked to give you the same historical parameters that were measured, and then it also allows you to predict a whole lot of other parameters that aren't measured. So that allows for both solar radiation and wind speed data that can be used. I believe there's also, you can do runoff modeling if you wanted to include more detail around hydro modeling, for example, that's also possible. Sarah, I think Sarah 3 is the latest data set. This is primarily used for solar PV modeling. I believe, and open to correction, but I think from what we've seen is the cloud cover modeling that's captured in Sarah 3 is a bit more accurate than what you see in ERA5. So this data set you have to download separately, and both of these can be accessed through the @Light interface, which I'll talk you through now. We've then done some kind of additional spot checks so we really love the NREL system advisor model, and that has direct links where it can talk to the National Solar Radiation Database, Meteostat, and essentially what we've done is we took a relatively coarse grid for the whole of the country, and we downloaded each of those data points from the NSRDB, and we used this mainly to check against ERA5 and Sarah to see if we were getting any data. So that's on the NSRDB side, and then finally we did a similar thing on WASA, so the Wind Atlas of South Africa, and that's part of a it's essentially I think they do it, but it starts from, if I'm understanding correctly, from the ERA5, and then it goes down to a bit more mesoscale modeling. So you can get, the problem with the ERA5 grid is it's quite coarse. It's in the order of about 30 by 30 kilometers, I think. So that allows you to get a bit more higher resolution on the model. But again, unfortunately, it's kind of a very data intensive. It's not so easy to download, and basically you have to manually download all these points, but I think you can engage with the UCT team, and that it is possible to get kind of a direct access to that info, but it's big as well, so multiple gigs. So from a quick usability perspective, ERA5 and Sarah are pretty usable. They're quite quick and easy to do through @Light. And then we did a bit more detailed checks with NREL and WASA, but ultimately these two data sets came out pretty well in comparison. So in order to get access to ERA5, the first thing is you're going to need to generate an API key. So in order to do that, you want to log in, create an account with Copernicus. If you follow this link, then you can download and get that information. I see a few questions coming through. So TSAM, how does TSAM adjust period and snapshot weightings? Yeah, so on the TSAM side, it essentially when it agglomerates to adjacent snapshots, then it will adjust the weighting. So for example, if there's an area of 5 hours that it then merges together, then those 5 hours will have a snapshot weighting of 5. And it will be represented as one time step within the model. At the moment, we haven't done anything fancy in terms of using TSAM over different years. So we treat basically every year as a kind of its own distinct 8760 hours. We run TSAM on that, and then we restack all of those snapshots onto each other. We haven't done anything around different weighting on the actual investment periods itself. So pypsa, so Etienne's comment, files people use the private optimization platforms open access. Yeah, so you're right. So you can decide obviously what you want to make public or not. So there are a general set of input data that is being built on transparent and open data that you can use. And then any specific analysis that you've done on your local machine, you have complete control of if you publish that analysis or not. It's not like it gets fed back to everyone else. But the kind of the platform and the data as much as possible. Well, really, we don't use any confidential data in the model by design. So everything that we use to run the model, you should be have available to run the model yourself. Era 5 does forecasts. Cool. I didn't know that, Tristan. So that's interesting. But yeah, I assume you pay for it, right? And Bruno, why not use Renewables Ninja where it's already done for you? Yeah, so Renewables Ninja, it's been a while since I looked at it. I understood it primarily Era 5, or actually at the time it was not, there was another database it was using. What we found was we wanted a lot more control over exactly what we're modeling, which regions we're modeling, which areas we are aggregating together. But ultimately, the way that pypsa RSA is designed is you just have to prepare a resource file that's in the right XArray format. So you can skip all the scripts where we do the resource processing, and you can, for example, do that all in Renewables Ninja. As long as the input data is kind of pre-processed into a format that the pypsa RSA model will expect, then that's definitely possible. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, I know we're a little bit over time, but just spending a few minutes going through the resource processing. So what you'll see in the pypsa RSA repository is there's a folder called pre-processing and then something called resource processing. And we've specifically done this in Jupyter Notebook, so it's very simple and easy to understand. And the first notebook that you're going to want to go to is to create the @light cutout. So there's a little bit of a description here of how you can get your API, and if you want to download any additional data. We are using @light predominantly to interface to get the data, and there's some great examples on their website. Here we go, @light. So you can, if there's anything that isn't clear in the code, you can see some examples of how @light interfaces. So a cutout is basically like a container that contains all the relevant information, predominantly weather data, and then after you process it, also having power data. So you want to give it a path where you're going to build your cutout file. You want to tell it, so you'll uncomment these. what module you use. So if you just want to use Era 5, what the latitude and longitude extent of your X and Y coordinates are, and the time slice that you want to download. So for example, here, this covers South Africa, Era 5, and we are going to download between 2020 and 2021. Be careful of trying to download too much data all at once, because your requests kind of just get clogged up and then nothing downloads. So you can't go and download like 20 years at once, and it would probably take forever. So if you already have a cutout, so I've already run this script in the past, so that's why I've commented those out. You can see then what a cutout looks like. So the cutout is basically so it's a X-array data set. So you've got your GPS coordinates, and you've got a time variable. So this is now for the years between 2010 and 2022 there, it looks like. And here's a whole lot of the different weather data that's been downloaded. So you've got wind speed at 100 meters, azimuth, roughness, you've got solar radiation data, etc., all of these. So there's the raw data, and that's pretty much all the script does. So it's just preparing the cutouts that you need, which get used then in later scripts. One thing to point out, you need to download the Sarah data. Atlight can't download it directly, so you have to go to the link and download the data that you're going to use, and just be warned that the Sarah data is quite substantial. What we might be able to do is provide some pre-processed cutouts that include Sarah data. We'll just have to see how big they are. I think there'll be a few gigs each, but we could do that for a year or two to make available. Then the second script that's kind of useful to jump into is the prepare availability matrix. Now, within Atlight, the term availability matrix is really just if you've got this pretty coarse grid of 30 or 40 kilometers square, how many points within that grid are available for generation, versus so you might find that half of that grid is covered by an exclusion zone. So this allows you to say, okay, well, only 50% of capacity could be installed in that cell. So what the script does is it loads all the different GIS data that we have. So those files that I showed you earlier, you can go to download all of them, and then just make sure you give it the path of kind of where you have that. And this is what you get. So these red areas are protected and conservation areas. You've obviously got your red zones. This here is a exclusion related to the SKA. And then there's also where EIA applications have been made. I think these are being shown in the dark green. So yeah, again, kind of back to your point, Bruno, like don't know how much flexibility Renewables Ninja has to kind of now where you start, okay, well, we only want the profiles for example, the red zones or so forth. We don't want a whole broad area. Also, especially with wind, it's quite difficult to go from like, if you might have single points in an area, but how do you get an aggregate profile where you might have huge variations between points? So especially on the wind side, we do some processing where you can, for example, specify the quantile that you'd like to select. So if you want like the whatever percentile that you want, so it would take like the top 10% of wind generators in a region, for example, and aggregate their profile. Okay, so this is the exclusion zone, and this is kind of basically what it looks like afterwards. So here's an example where I said just take the the power corridors and the red zones. And what you see is everywhere there's kind of a green or dark green cell, that means that cell is available and contributing to the generation profile that's in the area. So, for example, in this case, KwaZulu-Natal would only be looking at this area that's been available. But obviously, if you have EIAs and stuff, you can look at different profiles. So that's essentially what sets the availability. We also have a short bit of code that looks at building areas. So if you wanted to do some kind of rooftop PV availability modeling, there are data sets like open buildings, but we found they're just really, really big. But this shape file, I can't remember exactly where we got it, but we'll point you to it. Had some shape files for building areas, and then we can use that to estimate which areas should correspond to rooftop generation. Then the kind of final set of scripts are, there's two categories for each for wind and solar. So the one is fixed generators and the other is extendable. So for fixed generators, we go to the exact GPS coordinates of all the different REAP sites, and that's where we get those actual generation profiles where we know that those generators exist. So we generate time series data. So we get the resource data, we generate time series data, and then we turn that into a unitized profile. We've also used some of the other tools available. So there's both from the AtLight functionality. We've also used PySam, which is from the NREL set of availability or tools that are available, and we ran both of those, and they give pretty good results, and they're pretty comparable with each other. But we have to make AtLight has one flaw in its solar PV modeling, in that it doesn't account for DC AC ratio. So we have to make a modification from that, and that obviously makes a big difference as we're starting to get DC AC ratios that are kind of above 1.2. Excluding that starts to have more and more of an impact. So we have some custom code that's available that does an estimation of it kind of clips the load and takes into account the DC AC ratio. So that's for solar. For wind, we have a similar story, except we mainly are looking at ERA 5 and WASA data. On ERA 5, because the cells are so coarse, essentially they smooth quite a bit of the wind generation potential. So what happens is you underestimate the kind of maximum wind that's available in a cell, because it's kind of taking this average of a very broad area. So what we do is we do apply a kind of attempted correction factor to that, which is based on the global wind atlas. So the global wind atlas data is kind of average wind speed with a much higher spatial resolution. And what we do is we just compare that to the ERA 5 data, the average wind speed across a cell, and then we apply a correction to that. And that's kind of what that correction factor looked like. Hub height, etc., gets specified, and then ERA 5 or WASA with a straight power curve, a smooth power curve, is used to estimate the wind generation potential. Finally, then we have the extendable generators. So in pypsa nomenclature, extendable is something that you are optimizing its capacity, and fixed is like a fixed existing capacity. And here, for both solar and wind, there are two scripts that allow you to kind of build these resource files for different regions. Again, so it reads in the data, it looks at the availability that you specify, and ultimately it generates a net CDF file that's a time series file with all the relevant info that the pypsa RSA model needs. What we do is once we've run all of these time series scripts, so you have your different modules and you get all these different netcdf files, we just combine them into one netcdf file that's easier to import into the model. So there's basically a prepare single resource file that just reads in all of these and it applies them as groups to the final netcdf file, and this is the only file that the model looks for. And then just, in terms of bringing that all together, what that looks like, you can plot, for example, here, if we wanted to compare, let's just make this a little bit bigger. If we wanted to compare the output generators from Era 5, Sarah, and pypsa, and those are all overlaid here compared to the ESCOM data portal data. So if you wanted to zoom in on a specific day, for example. What did I do there? Didn't like my... So here's the different power outputs projections. It does get a little bit tricky making sure that the data set start time is properly captured. So basically the some of the data sets, like 6 o'clock means it's starting at 6 o'clock. Some of them mean it's the average between 6 and 7, and some of them mean it's towards the end of that period, looking back. So just we tried our best to make sure that the data sets are relatively consistent in terms of where there's an hourly offset or not. So those have been applied. And here's the kind of the wind profiles. So the blue dashed is the WASA profile, the red dashed is from Era 5 with our kind of global correction factor. And just to show that we're not cherry picking behavior, you can see that in general the trends followed quite closely. So yeah. And that's it. So we've done some benchmarking against the data that CSR and Fraunhofer had. So you've got the this was what was done by CSR and Fraunhofer for the 27 supply regions. I think that data is only available for 2012 or 2013. And you can then see how the CSR data for those supplied regions compares. And then also the kind of one of the challenges within the CSR Fraunhofer data is that the solar data is based on a mix. It's all fixed tilt and it's based primarily on rooftop solar with, I think, a 70-30 mix. So as far as I understand, that's the profile that the DMRE still uses in the RP, compared to if we're now looking at single axis tracking plants with much higher DC-AC ratios. You can see that those average profiles are significantly higher than the kind of more dated Fraunhofer profiles. So that's pretty much it for this first section. So at the moment we could probably improve quite significantly how the resource data gets read into the actual pypsa RSA model. So please let us know if you have any challenges in terms of kind of how you get your netcdf file into the model. If you're not using this workflow, it might give you a little bit of a headache just in terms of making sure that everything is labeled properly and that it's in the same format that the pypsa RSA model is expecting. So I think we're a bit over time. So I don't know if there's any questions, uh, comments, or insults. We're happy to kind of take some final questions and closing remarks. Next week, what we'll do is work through how you would actually use the more broader model itself, how you would go about configuring different scenarios, how you would specify all the technical parameters for existing and extendable generators and load. And then hopefully that's enough information to kind of get you kick-started in using the model and running it yourself. So if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to just jump straight in. You don't have to type it or anything. Otherwise, we'll call it a day. Okay, doesn't seem like anyone has any burning questions. So thanks for taking the time to sit through our first session. As I said, we will make this recording available. So if you want to start working through the library and the model in your own time, you can go back and use that as a resource. And if there's anything that you get stuck on, feel free to drop it. I think what we're going to do is establish a Discord channel where you can join and ask any specific questions on. That way, if it's any question, then that we can make that available for everyone, so everyone else can benefit from those questions and answers. Reserves handled. Last question, reserves handled. Yes. So at the moment, we tussled with the reserves question quite a bit. So in our resource adequacy, the kind of more dispatch model that we use, that has some more detailed spinning and non-spinning reserve constraints. In the end, we don't include those reserve constraints in the capacity expansion model because they add quite significantly to the computational time. What we do is still include the kind of traditional planning reserve margin. So that the idea is that mostly subsumes the operational reserves. And what that does is it looks at kind of your peak demand in each year, and it says for capacity credits on different generators, this is your capacity credit times your installed capacity must be greater than X percentage from your maximum demand. We find the model outcomes are very sensitive to this planning reserve margin. So for our RP work, we kept that concept of planning reserve margin, so we were kind of consistent with past studies. But our view and kind of what we see in the literature is that planning reserve margin is not the relevance of that metric is kind of in question as we move to more and more variable renewables. And some of the kind of literature and thinking is that instead of this kind of brute force planning reserve margin, that you have to run multiple weather years and look at more kind of statistical outage probabilities, etc. So just meeting your planning reserve margin under the current criteria is not 100% guarantee anymore that you won't have load shedding. So that's definitely an area of ongoing work. But at the moment, it's captured just in a kind of planning reserve margin. Okay, if there's nothing else, I think we call it a day. I hope you all have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.